We're going to be exploring the createElement method. So this is a method within the HTML document object that allows us to create HTML elements by specifying the tag name of the element that we want to create. So in this case, we're going to be creating a div and outputting that div on the page. So appending it to the element that we've got with the class of output, and then updating the values of that page element within the JavaScript code. So going over to the Mozilla Developer Network, we're going to be making a reference to the coding examples at the Mozilla Developer Network, and this is a great place to reference your JavaScript code. So they do have an example for the Document.querySelector. So essentially what it does is it returns the first element of the document that matches the selection, and we did use that in the last lesson where we set a variable to whatever the document query selector was returning, and this is just returning back that first match. Within the HTML, we only did have the one element with a class of output, so that returned back that first element with the class of output. So if we were to add several elements with a class of output, we would still only be referencing the first one on the page. So just as we used that method in order to select a page element, we can also create page elements within the document object, and there's a method called createElement. And what createElement does is it creates an element that is by whatever the specified tag name, and you also have an opportunity to add in options. So this is optional, so you don't have to have the options, but you do need to, or you should have, the tag name that you want to create. So let's provide an example of that, and we'll create one of these on the page. So within the JavaScript code, we're going to create some elements. I'm going to give a name of div1. So this is how we're referring to it within the JavaScript code. And then using the document object, we can select the method that's createElement. And then within the arguments, it's expecting a value of a string value for the tag name. So this will actually create a div. And if we were to log out the div object, we get the div being logged into the console. And it has all of the same properties as the element that we selected. So all of these properties and values that we have within the element as we've selected it. And this is the output element that we created within the HTML code. And when we open up div, we see we've got all of the same properties. So once you can see the properties, you can also set these values. And so if we were to select the text content of the output, we don't have any value for there. And even if we can select it, that means that we can also assign a value. So if we want to assign a string value to the output of the text content, that would populate the content on the page. So going back into the elements and into the source, so now we see within the div with the class of output, we have the words hello world. So this has been added using JavaScript. So we can do the same thing for the elements that we're creating, where we can set a text content. So by default, it's not going to have any text content. And if we open up the element object, we can scroll down to where it's got the text content, and we see that this property, the value is blank. So select the div1, and let's add in text content property value. And for this, we will say text1 hello. So when we save that, now within the div, we've got the value of text1 hello, and this is going to be the HTML for this element that we're outputting on the page. And if we want to reference the text content, that's going to return back the text content that's contained within the element. So we also want to be able to add it onto the page, because right now when we go into the HTML content, we're not going to see anything within the elements. So that element that we created with the div1, we don't see that anywhere on the page. So let's go ahead and we're going to add it to the page. So in order to add it, we need to specify the parent, and then we can use the method append to that parent object and select the element that we want to append. So in this case, we want to append div1. And now when we open up the output, we can see we've got the original text of hello world. And within that original text, we've got a value for text1 that says hello, and that's being output on the page. And now this value of div1 is going to be referring to that particular object, and once it's placed on the page, we can still reference it and select it with that object value. And there is a difference between append and append child, and there's also an option to prepend. So if we were to prepend that value, that's going to actually add the value of text1 hello, that element that we created, and it's going to add it before the hello world. So prepend adds it before, append adds it after. So what happens if we append it and then we prepend it? So if we do an append and then we prepend, what's going to happen is it's not going to create a second element. It's going to be always, because we're referencing that as an object. So what it's going to do, first it's going to append it, and then afterwards it's going to prepend it. So the last line of code is going to have it prepending it, so it's actually moving it above the hello world. So originally it appended it, set it after the hello world, and now it set it before the hello world. So this is going to always be referencing that same object, and it's not going to create a second object on the page. With append and prepend, there's going to be no value that's being returned back. So if we were to select and get the value, and if we console log out the result for val1, and we open it up within the console, we see we've got a value of undefined, because append doesn't have a response value, and it's just going to return back undefined. However, if you do want to return back the element that has been added, you can do an output append child method, and the difference here is that once we append child the div1, we're going to get a response back for val2, and if we use val2 and output it into the console, we're going to see that it's referencing that same element. So in fact, val2 is going to be referencing the same element as div1. And that means that if you're selecting and updating the text content of val1 or val2, that's going to also update the text content of the div. And we can see it whenever we want to console log out the div1 text content. This is going to still output that same value of val2. And the reason that happens is because the val2 and the div1, they're going to be referencing that same element, and that's contained within the document object. So this is an object value that we're referencing, and the objects in JavaScript are going to be referencing a memory location. So it doesn't matter what variable and how many variables we set and assign to that memory location, they're going to all function as one. So we make changes to one, it will still reflect changes in the other one as well. So that's where we're able to make the updates, and that's why as well we can use the keyword const and update the properties and values within the object that's contained within the object. So now it's up to you. Create an element on the page. You can add in some text content and append it to your existing page element, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.